want to acknowledge something to you before we begin a subject like this and a seminar with the title, What is Conservatism? I'm going to make a promise to you that by the end of the session today, each and every one of you will be unsatisfied. I've been laughing with people over the last couple of days. This is the session that I'm most nervous about. I've given this talk a couple of times, but it's always the one that generates the most lively conversation, the most heated disagreements, and the most also some of the most interesting perspectives on what it means to be a conservative. You will likely think that I am wrong about a lot of things. You will likely think that I have left out many things in my discussion of what conservatism is. You will hopefully find some things in my talk today that you will find helpful and beneficial to you in learning about conservatism and in thinking about the conservative movement as it has taken place over the course of time. I'm going to focus mostly on the American tradition, although I'll mention a few people across the water. But I will apologize to you in advance because you probably will be unsatisfied at the end. But that's actually not a bad thing. I don't think that if you leave here after only an hour and 15 minutes thoroughly satisfied, that would have been a good session. I think it's healthy to walk out with more questions than you came in with. So it'll be interesting to have our session today, and I'm very interested to know about your perspectives and about your questions that you'll have as well. Now, I want to read to you, to start off, the words to a very famous song. This song was written in 1760 by a man named Charles Thomson. And it is the sort of unofficial national anthem for Great Britain. And it was a very famous song, especially in the 19th century and the 20th century. And it's sung at the end of the proms each year as part of the patriotic celebration of the proms. And this song will be familiar to some of you. We might have some vocalists in the room. We might have somebody maybe lead us in a couple of strains of this song. I will not be singing this song. You're welcome for that. But here are some of the lines from this song. When Britain first, at heaven's command, arose from out the azure main, this was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sang this strain. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons shall never be slaves. Still more majestic shalt thou rise, more dreadful from each foreign stroke, as the loud blast, the blast that tears the skies, serves but to root thy native oak. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons shall never be slaves. The Muses still with freedom found shall to thy happy coast repair, blessed isle with matchless beauty praised, and manly hearts to guard the fair. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons will never be slaves. That song was written in the context of what we call the French and Indian War, and on the continent is called the 7 Years' War. Britain and Prussia faced off against the might of the Austrians and the French, the Spanish. Spanish were later allies of the British, but the song was aimed at what the British saw in those days as the tyrannies of France and Spain, their historic enemies over the course of many centuries. So when you hear the words to that song, and especially when you hear the song performed or sung, or maybe you've been to the proms and maybe you've heard all the people sing this song. Do you see that song, and do you see the activity of singing a song like that as jingoistic, as imperialistic, as old-fashioned, as irrelevant, not fitting for the modern world? Do you find it racist? Do you find it provincial? Or do you see it as a healthy and natural expression of love for country as home, for civic unity around a national mythos and shared history? The preservation of tradition and a link to the past with those who have passed on this before us, who have lived life and have died, who have maybe given their lives on behalf of home and hearth to protect tradition, to protect civilization, to protect culture of a particular familiar place, a group that you're a member of. Those are two extremes, of course, maybe not extremes, but they're two poles. You might be somewhere in the middle when you think about how you react to a song like that and to lyrics like that, and to what that song not just says in the lyrics and in the words, but also what the song represents and how the song has been received over the course of the years. You might have a perspective on it that is more sympathetic to such an activity and to such a song, and you might also be more critical of it. However you answer those questions is, in sort of a basic, sort of a fundamental sense, is an indication of whether or not and how much you are a conservative. The title of the session is "What is a Conservative?" And as I indicated earlier in the beginning of the session, it's very difficult to give a definition, and I don't have a definition for you. I tricked you. I brought you into this room, and you thought you were going to get a simple definition, and I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't have one for you. It is a brilliantly diverse tradition. There are some of us in this room who are traditionalists, and you are conservatives. There are some in this room who maybe grew up as anti-communists, and that's a historical tradition in conservatism. There are probably many of you who are libertarians, and some libertarians don't like to be called conservatives, and some do. I'll talk about the black conservative tradition very briefly in this seminar. And the black conservative tradition is very different than the white conservative traditions. But nevertheless, it's a very important American conservative tradition in the United States. It's a very varied and diverse movement. One of my favorite authors in the history of conservatism is Patrick Allett. Many of you have probably read his book on the conservatives and on the history of conservatism in America, going back to the Federalists. I was talking to somebody yesterday. He has a very interesting thesis about the Civil War. He writes that the Civil War was a war between two conservative strands, two conservative philosophies. The North was trying to conserve something, trying to conserve the Union. The South was trying to conserve something, the institution of slavery and a way of life that revolved around that institution. But they did so. They sought to conserve and preserve those two things using radical means. In the South was the first to initiate conscription, which was quite radical for the time and unprecedented in American history. The North would do the same. Both sides suspended habeas corpus. And in the South, in the case of the South, their, of course, commitment was to state rights. But in order to win the war, they had to sort of place all their emphasis on group effort and to neglect state rights during the course of the war, much to the chagrin of Joseph Brown, who was the governor of Georgia. and an ardent state rights secessionist who withheld uniforms and food and ammunition from the Confederate Army because Georgia units were leaving the boundaries of the state of Georgia. That contributed to the loss of the Confederacy. So it's interesting, Allitt's thesis is that it was a conservative war. And that, I think, gives us an indication of how conservatives often are at war with one another. We have circular firing squads a lot. And sometimes I think people who are on the outside of the conservative tradition think of conservatives as being rather esoteric, rather abstract. But conservatives, I think, are that, but I think conservatives also can be quite pragmatic in advancing their values and their beliefs. And I think the Civil War does prove that in trying to conserve something, in trying to advocate for a conservative position. Both sides were willing to go to radical extremes in order to do that. Is conservative or are conservatives people who vote Republican? Is that what makes a conservative? Is conservatism defined primarily by what side of a particular issue you come down on, such as marriage and the family and the propriety of gay marriage? So wherever you are in that, does that make you a conservative? Does it make you conservative in terms of what your views are on abortion? School choice, religious freedom. What if you're not a religious person? Do you have to be a religious person to be a conservative? Can you be secular? What about your views on the free market? If your views on the free market are sympathetic, does that make you a conservative? Race relations, immigration. In other words, however you fall on these particular public issues, does that make a person a conservative or a progressive? And what about theological conservatism? If one is theologically conservative, does that mean that that person will necessarily be politically conservative, economically conservative, socially conservative? What about the description right-wing? If you are right-wing, does that mean that you are a conservative? If you voted for Trump, does that mean that you are a conservative? If you read the pages of the major newspapers and listen to the media and look at social media, the answer to the question is yeah. If you voted for Trump, you're a conservative. If you didn't vote for Trump, you're not a conservative. I think the popular image today of what a conservative is where we fall on particular issues. So if you're in favor of school choice, that means you're a conservative. If you're pro-life, you're a conservative. If you're not sympathetic to gay marriage, you're a conservative. If you're for a strong military, you're a conservative. But I don't think that that's the essence of what being a conservative is, and I think you probably will agree with me on that. You may disagree, but I think you probably agree. I think those things are entailed in being a conservative. I think being conservative means that, yes, you're going to fall down on certain positions in terms of public policy, but conservatism is much more than just public policy. Think of defining conservatism in a similar way as defining philosophy, broadly conceived. Philosophy is a way of thinking about particular disciplines, particular subjects, particular activities. You can have a philosophy, for example, of grilling a steak. You can have a philosophy of making waffles, eggs, breakfast food. My father is very particular about the way he makes his pancakes. He's a breakfast man. He's not very good in the kitchen with anything else except for breakfast stuff. He loves to make breakfast. And when I was a kid, he used to love to make fried eggs. He didn't like scrambled eggs. He didn't think scrambled eggs were any good, and he always made fried eggs. So when I was a child, I never really had scrambled eggs because that was his philosophy of making breakfast, and he was very intent on that. You can have a philosophy of history. I'm a historian. I'm an American historian. And in my school of historiography is most sympathetic with a neoconservative school of historiography. And in philosophy of history, neoconservatism means something different than it means in the political sphere. Neoconservative philosophers of history or historiographers tend to want to recover the old consensus model of the 1950s and 1960s. I see American history as being defined by consensus around a certain group of ideas, the founding ideas that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so forth. In contrast, New Left historians see American history as being basically defined by conflict. Conflict between class, conflict between gender, conflict between races. And conflict is what marks American history off and how American history is recognizable. History from below. And I'm not that kind of a historian. So you can have a philosophy of history, and that can be a conservative one, or it can be a progressive one. You can have a philosophy of theology, a philosophy of culture. Conservatism is like philosophy. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking about how you dress, a way of thinking about movies, culture, art, music. It's a way of thinking about politics, a way of thinking about the family, a way of thinking about order in society, a way of thinking about the individual's place in society. Is the basic unit of society the individual? Or is the basic unit of society a group? Conservatives of different varieties have embraced both positions. Specifically, I think conservatism, and I follow Patrick Allett in this, in thinking about this. Basically, very fundamentally, conservatism is a particular way of thinking about change. Change within various contexts of crises over time. Now, John Stuart Mill is famous for having said that the conservatives were the stupid party because conservatives don't like change and resist change. And in the history of conservatism in Britain and America, I don't think that that is a defining feature of the conservative movement and conservative people. I think you do find traditionalists who want to resist change. And as Patrick Allett says in his book, such conservatives are neither innovative nor are they interesting. But conservatives, I think, truly do recognize that change is part of human nature, part of the nature of things, the nature of the universe. Change is inevitable. And change is not necessarily something that we want to resist on its face. But change is something that should be managed carefully. How quickly change should happen is something that conservatives are concerned about. What change is, what it entails, something that conservatives, I think, are very concerned about. What processes by which change ought to be managed, something that conservatives want to be careful about. Expectations about change, as well as how to react to change and also unintended consequences that come about as a result of change. What things can change and what things cannot change, and what things we have the power to change and what things we do not have the power to change as finite individuals. Conservatism is less a standardized orthodoxy and more a pattern of responses to change in particular situations. And it's a pattern informed by a high value placed on tradition, rule of law, order, and clear ideas and a clear division between right and wrong. Abraham Lincoln I think is a great representative of of American conservatism. Abraham Lincoln is a great example of someone who saw a very clear distinction between right and wrong. When he thought about slavery, he proposed to treat slavery as a wrong, he said, as we would treat any wrong, to hopefully, eventually, to eradicate it. In 1862, he was confronted by a group of ministers who insisted that God was on the side of the Union. And Lincoln famously said, we cannot make that kind of a statement. We can't say that God is on our side. He said that, the Southerners thought that God was on their side too. He famously said this in his second inaugural. That both sides pray to the same God and both sides claim God to be their champion. Lincoln said he was mostly concerned with whose side are we on. And if we are on the side of right, then we will be on God's side. So he had a very clear distinction between right and wrong. It was not a nuanced perspective on what was right and what was wrong. And conservatives place a very high value on right and wrong, especially as it's informed by religion. And in America, that means the Judeo-Christian tradition. With change as a frame of reference for thinking about what conservatism is, conservatism also entails a particular philosophy of history. History is very important to conservatives and has always been. Both conservative and progressive outlooks situate the person, orient the person, the group, the nation, and ultimately humanity in general, in time. Progressives orient the group in time with an orientation and an emphasis on the future. But conservatives orient groups in time with an emphasis on the past. There's something that is very popular today to talk about, gets people all riled up, Christian nationalism. I've been studying Christian nationalism for 20 years. It's only been a year or so ago that people got interested in it. Nobody ever bought my book until like 2 years ago. Now people are buying my book, which is great. It's out there on the table, It's interesting to me. Americans have always blended their identity with theology, going all the way back to the colonial period. And most expressions of what is being called Christian nationalism, I don't think all of those expressions are strictly speaking Christian nationalism, but let's just grant the term for its ease of use for a moment. Christian nationalism is a great example of this. How Americans have seen themselves, how they identify themselves, how they differentiate themselves from other nations, other groups of people. Most of the time in American history, going back to the colonial founding, Americans have oriented themselves in time with an emphasis on the future. John Ellis Sullivan, the man who coined the term manifest destiny, said that we are the great nation of futurity. Thomas Paine famously said that we have it in our power to begin the world anew. An emphasis on the future, an emphasis on inevitable progress, turning their back on the past and on the traditions of old Europe, and turning their attention to the West, to innovation and newness, a novus ordo seclorum, a new order for the ages. This orientation to the future has always been, or most of the time has been, the way that Americans in general have seen themselves. What people are reacting against today, what people call Christian nationalism today, is different. It's a different kind of orientation. Since about 1977, Christian nationalism has oriented the nation towards the past. Questions like, was America founded as a Christian nation? Were the founders Christians? What were the religious origins of revolutionary ideas? And also the thesis that America was founded as a Christian nation and has fallen from its roots and must recover itself. A declension narrative. Declension narratives are always conservative because they always seek a golden age in the past and a return to that golden age in the present. There's nothing wrong with those kinds of things inherently. Declension narratives, progressive narratives, we see these things going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, these ways of writing history. It's part of human nature to orient a group in time. It's part of what makes us created in the image of God. We have an awareness of time and an awareness of our place in time. Dogs and cats and horses and fish don't have an awareness of time, but human beings do. And conservatives value the past. And conservatives also place an emphasis when they think about the past on continuities. They recognize that the past is foreign. The famous statement that historians love to quote from L.P. Hartley, the British novelist, who said, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." All good historians recognize the foreignness of the past, but progressives emphasize the foreignness of it. Conservatives emphasize continuities. Permanent things, as Russell Kirk described them. Things like beauty, order, justice, the transcendence and immanence of God, humanity's fallen nature and proclivity to wrong and sin, and the certainty of death. I teach history at Southern Seminary and at Boyce College, and one of the things I like to do with the undergraduates when I teach American history and church history to them, each semester I take my Boyce College undergraduates on an interesting excursion and a lesson in historical thinking as a conservative. I take them out at night to Mammoth Cave National Park. We go out at night to the park. I teach them how to use a map and a compass. So we go off the trail into the woods. Some of the kids are like, "Where is he taking us?" We go out with flashlights and we go about 2 miles out into the woods, way off the trail, with our map and compass. And we go out to this old cemetery. It's way out in the woods. It was, a cemetery of a community that existed there prior to the creation of the park in the 30s. And it's a 19th century cemetery. There's some wealthy people that are buried there. There's some poor people that are buried there. But it's an old community, long forgotten. There's a little gravestone in that cemetery. A young man who was about 18 years old who died in 1896. And there's a memento mori on his gravestone, and I love this memento mori. I think you'll like it too. Inscribed on the gravestone, it says, "Remember, friends, as you pass by, that all mankind are born to die. So let your cares on Christ be cast, that you may dwell with him at last." I take them to the cemetery at night to get them to think about their death. That in the memento mori, the dead say to us, "As you are now, I once was. As I am now, you one day will be." Conservatives value things like that. Progressives don't. Progressive historians don't place an emphasis on these things. Conservatives do. Now, who are some of the major conservative thinkers in American history? Edmund Burke, of course, not an American. He's Irishman, a member of Parliament, died in 1797, wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France. He's commonly understood to have been the first person to launch the conservative movement in response to the French Revolution. Alexander Hamilton died in 1804, one of the primary authors of the Federalist Papers, Washington's aide-de-camp and his Secretary of the Treasury. John C. Calhoun died in 1850, South Carolina Senator, Vice President under Andrew Jackson, wrote Disquisition on Government, in which he laid out the idea of the concurrent majority, the idea of minority rights against the tyranny of the majority, culminating in the nullification crisis of 1828. Alexis de Tocqueville, who died in 1859, authored Democracy in America and the Old Regime in the French Revolution. Henry Adams, grandson of John Quincy Adams, great-grandson of John Adams. Wrote a 9-volume history of the United States called The History of the United States of America, 1801 to 1817. 9 volumes. It's a great study. It's actually quite a great overlooked history of the United States. He also wrote a book called Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres, which many of you have probably read, extolling the unity of medieval society and comparing it to the industrial age and saying, actually, the industrial age does not mark the apex of human civilization. It doesn't compare to the stained glass at Chartres. Herbert Hoover, who was the 3rd Secretary of Commerce, of course, President of the United States, died in 1964, believed that government should be small and unobtrusive during normal times. But during emergencies, it was acceptable for government to grow in power. John Foster Dulles, there's a great biography out there on the table. You should definitely all go out and buy. It's great. I mean, it's like one of the best books you probably will ever read. It's out there on the table. Just a joke there. Secretary of State under Eisenhower, famous anti-communist. Henry Luce, who founded Fortune magazine, Time magazine, Life magazine, died in 1967. Wrote an essay called The American Century in 1941. It kind of laid out the vision for foreign policy in the remainder of the 20th century into the 21st century. Clare Boothe Luce, his wife, very famous conservative of the post-war period, congresswoman from Connecticut from 1942 to 1946, and the first American ambassador who was a woman. She was the ambassador to Italy from 53 to 56. Kind of a towering figure in American conservatism. She was a Catholic convert. She was a partisan for Dwight Eisenhower and a rabid anti-communist. Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was president of the University of Chicago. He was a great proponent of the conservation of ideas of Western civilization in the great books, and advocated for education as being not something for industrial training, but for citizenship. Richard Weaver, the great English professor at the University of Chicago, who died in 1963, wrote Ideas Have Consequences, a book that probably all of you have read, where he wrote a declension narrative, looked at the decline of civilization and marked it in 1348 with the beginning of the denial of universals with William of Ockham. Russell Kirk, of course, died in 1994. Traditionalist conservative, author of The Conservative Mind, a book that was his doctoral dissertation from the University of St. Andrews and one of the most important post-war conservatives in America. In the black conservative tradition, you have Frederick Douglass, died in 1895, wrote the narrative and life of Frederick Douglass, great abolitionist, but also a great believer in American exceptionalism. Believed in the American Constitution as a freedom document and staked everything in the abolitionist movement on the Constitution, differentiating himself from the abolitionist wing that repudiated the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. People like William Lloyd Garrison, who burned the Constitution in Boston publicly, said it was a pact with the devil. Frederick Douglass disagreed with that. He started out agreeing with that, but then he came around and believed that the Constitution was actually the key to human freedom. Booker T. Washington, who died in 1915, rode up from slavery. He was a proponent of the economic and social uplift of African Americans. Carter Woodson, who was an education innovator, wanted to emphasize in the curricula of historically black colleges the idea that African Americans have a culture of their own, that they're not simply annexed to American culture. They're not just simply subsumed under Anglo culture. They have their own culture, and that culture should be, the contours of that culture should be defined clearly and celebrated. Zora Neale Hurston, who died in 1960, a novelist of the Harlem Renaissance, and a famous member of the Republican Party. Conservatism is not made up of a standardized set of orthodoxies, but there are features of thought that are shared over time from the 18th century to today. For example, about change, I've mentioned a few things. Conservatives don't resist change, but they are skeptical of radical change because they believe that human nature favors the familiar, the permanent over the different. Local loyalties, hometowns, home teams, local food and music are things to be valued. I think one of the things that we see in our society today because of television and because of ubiquity of information is the leveling out of regional accents. I'm from Georgia, and my mother has a very distinct Southern accent. She sounds like a Southern lady. My grandparents had a very strong Southern accent. Many of you maybe have seen the Civil War documentary with Shelby Foote. When I listen to Shelby Foote, I hear my grandfather. That's exactly how he talked. You can't find very many people that talk like that anymore in the South or really anywhere else. Now, my father's side, they're from Montana, and they have a very Nordic sort of accent. They say things like, "Oh, the snow," things like that. And I don't think I have much of a Southern accent. I think I've lost a lot of my Southern accent. When I get with my family, I think I have more of a Southern accent. But when I would call my father at his office in Great Falls, Montana, his secretary would remark to my father, "Your son has the most beautiful Southern accent." I used to think, that's not... But because, it's Montana, she recognized it as such. George Eliot said, "The best introduction to astronomy is to think of the nightly heavens as a little lot of stars belonging to one's own homestead." I think that's a very beautiful description of what it means to be a conservative. Amina Malonich, she's a conservative writer. Many of you are familiar with her writings. She wrote that conservatives see human finitude as an impetus for recognizing opportunities to learn. In other words, to change. People on the left consider human potential to be unlimited and see revolution as an ideal and a way to overturn order, making them proponents of false progress, as she says. And I think that's right. Change should be procedural. It should follow the course of law. And our posture towards change should be realistic and cautious. The world will never be perfect. And efforts to perfect the world, to change the world, often lead to more harm than good. Human nature being inherently sinful and selfish is something that we see continuing all through history. Thomas Hobbes said that human nature has always been bent towards self-interest and ambition, quest for power. And conservatives historically have believed that any human community has to be organized with allowances for that sin and that proclivity to evil. We see that in the Federalist Papers. Another thing that's a permanent part of the human condition is war. Conservatives have been suspicious of the idea that we can abolish war. John Foster Dulles is an example of this. He was a student of Woodrow Wilson at Princeton when Wilson was president there. And he was a member of the American delegation to the Versailles Conference in 1919. He was a proponent of Wilsonian idealism for much of his career. But by the time he was Secretary of State, he'd come around to a realistic idea that war is not something that you can abolish. World War I being the war that will end all wars, that's not something that conservatives would ever really embrace. The best way, according to Dulles, to prevent war was to be so powerful and so nimble as to make any potential aggressor see that he had more to lose to start a war with the United States than he had to gain. Conservatives also believe that people always pursue their own interests. But that pursuit of private interests can result in the public good. Alexis de Tocqueville, he articulated his famous doctrine of self-interest rightly understood in the second volume of Democracy in America. He talked about how Americans, in his words, combine their own advantage with that of their fellow citizens. He talked about how an enlightened regard for themselves constantly prompts them to assist one another and inclines them willingly to sacrifice a portion of their time and property to the welfare of the state. It's Lockean, it's Tocquevillian. And informed by this idea of self-interest rightly understood, Americans were enabled to pursue prosperity as a group. They were able to balance public interests with private interests, body and soul, individual and family, rather than merely the pursuit of wealth, which is what socialism is concerned with. And conservatives believe that all important questions facing humanity have been asked and answered. This is where Robert Maynard Hutchins, I think, is someone I really admire. In his essay, The Great Conversation, at the beginning, the first volume of the great books, many of you have read that essay, he said, "We believe that the voices that may recall the West to sanity are those which have taken part in the great conversation. We want them to be heard, not because we want to go back to antiquity. We want the voices of the great conversation to be heard again because we think that they may help us to learn to live better now." And black conservatism, I just have a few things I want to say about black conservatism as a neglected tradition. Often, black conservatism is something that is repudiated in the African American community as well as in other communities as well. Black conservatives are often seen as being something like an Uncle Tom, traitors to their race. But I think that is a terribly unfair representation, and black conservative figures have always recoiled against that accusation. Black conservatism represents a deep-seated respect for Western civilization and for American ideals and institutions. Frederick Douglass is a great example of that. Western civilization and American ideals set the stage for blacks to be able to make their own way toward flourishing, using their own intellectual and cultural and spiritual resources. Black conservatism emphasizes the positive achievements of African Americans in the face of incredible obstacles. Black conservatives have never been indifferent to racism, and they've never been opposed to government intervention to come to their assistance. For example, in the Civil War and during the Civil Rights Movement. But they do emphasize individual and communal achievements rather than government intervention. Black conservatives will always give the credit to African American people and African American churches and families in the advancement of their interests in American history over and above the government, even when the government has proved to be an essential assistant. Racism for black conservatives is something that cannot just be eradicated by government action. And racism is also incompatible with American ideals and its moral order, despite the fact that American racism and race prejudice have resulted in slavery and segregation for 7/8 of their experience on this continent. Black conservatives are anti-utopian. They want to make use of available resources that they have now, rather than wishing for those that do not exist. And present circumstances are to be accepted and even enjoyed. Black conservatives say, "We will play by your rules, and you'll have no choice but to accept us as equals." And the victories that blacks have been won at a very dear price. That equal citizenship in America has been earned on every battlefield, in every war, that America has ever fought by black citizens who have been patriots and have taken pride in their American citizenship and their American identity. The foundation of black conservatism has always been the African American church. A church tradition that is moralistic, deferential to authority, both black and white. Rights are important, but duties to others are less abstract, more concrete, and more urgent. Some good books in black conservatism that I would recommend to you. Lee Walker's book, Rediscovering Black Conservatism. It's a great little introduction to the tradition. Angela Lewis's book, Conservatism in the Black Community, and Leah Wright Rigueur's book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican. These are three excellent examples of recent books in the African American conservative tradition. Now, conclude just to say again, conservatism, I think, is basically a way to think about change, with an emphasis on tradition as an inheritance, dearly won, handed down by those who knew what they were doing. As the book of Hebrews declares, a cloud of witnesses, an emphasis on fraternity over equality, duties over rights, the idea that uniformity is tyrannical. Local communities have the resources to deal with their own problems, that property is the foundation of liberty, that change is inevitable, but caution and respect for the past offers us wisdom in the midst of change. That concludes my talk. All right, so we're going to have a microphone go around and Q&A and insights and wisdom, and I'm very anxious to hear your thoughts. So we'll start right here with the gentleman with the jacket that looks very, very nice. We really are. None of y'all got the memo today.
I know, and you started with Rule Britannia as well, which is phenomenal. So there we
Wonderful.
I'm curious. I was very interested to hear you go through a number of conservative thinkers and writers, and I know as soon as anyone mentions the name Donald Trump, it could, sparks can fly, as you made reference. But I'm curious to your opinion, given your deep background in this area, as to how has he guided or changed the direction of conservatism in America, and what aspects of that are you most encouraged by and most discouraged by?
Okay. I'll start with the positives. I think, Trump's greatest, one of his greatest, I don't want to say the greatest, but one of his greatest accomplishments as president, and one of the things I'm most grateful for, has been, his Supreme Court appointments. And I think we're seeing the beneficial results of that coming out in the decisions that even come out this week. So I'm very grateful for that, and I think that's a very positive thing. But I think it's in spite of him. I don't believe Trump is a conservative, and I hate to see conservative people in the conservative movement closely identified with Trump. I don't think that Trump is a conservative by disposition or by thought. Having said that, he has been good at listening to conservatives in many ways. In terms of the negative things, I mean, we could all, we could spend the rest of the day talking about that, I guess, but I think that the most tragic thing, the most tragic ramification of the popular perception of Trump as a conservative and sort of the linking of conservatives with Trump has been the darker elements of Christian nationalism. Now, I'm a historian of Christian nationalism, and I like to think that I know what I'm talking about with regard to Christian nationalism, having studied it and read about it for a while. And the racist elements, the xenophobic elements, the heterodox and heretical elements of Christian nationalism, which are real, which are there and have always been there in certain communities and in certain times and contexts for 400 years. I think Trump does bring out some of the worst elements of that and has encouraged some of that. Although I will say that those bad, dark elements, they've always been there. They've always been in existence. Trump is not the inventor of Christian nationalism. It didn't just come about because of him. But I think so. What I was going to say was I think the tragic part of it is that if you're a conservative, conservatism has become almost a dirty word in American culture. I think some of the progress that conservatives have made since the end of the Second World War has been sullied by, especially by the Christian nationalistic elements. I don't think that Christian nationalism is as big a problem as the left would have us believe that it is. The idea that we need to save democracy and all that, I think is just absolute poppycock. What my grandfather called hogwash. I think it's there. I think it's a threat. I think it's overstated for political gain. I think it's the one issue that the left sees potential that can really gain traction in marginalizing religious people in the public square. I do fear that. And I think that is a direct consequence of the Trump presidency. Now, some of you may disagree. That's fine. No problem. We can all leave here friends. But that is, you asked my opinion. That's my opinion. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'd like also perhaps you to speak more to the nature of imagination as it runs through conservative thought. As you know, Russell Kirk makes a very strong argument for the tension between progress and continuity. And so Kirk leans very heavily on the high Tory tradition that comes to America through the UK.
Yes. Now, I think my answer to this question may be in a direction that you're not looking for. I think it's a big question, important question. But the role of imagination, I think, is fascinating. Roger Scruton being someone who's very big on this. And I love his take on beauty, being objective. His documentary on beauty is one of the best documentaries out there. All of y'all should watch that. But I love Russell Kirk. I think his ghost stories, being an example of this, are very, very important. As I sort of indicated earlier, the idea of a memento mori, his ghost stories are that, I think. Also the sort of a sacramental view of the world, that the world has mystery to it, that mystery conjures up deep feeling in a person, in a family, and in a group. These are elements of romanticism. But I think it's romanticism is a very interesting philosophical movement, as you all know very well. It's one of those things that, a lot of it is like, wow, really, really bad and terrible. And yet, it's irresistible, too. It's kind of like, it's weird this way. I think romantic movement, music is some of it can represent terrible things, but yet it's irresistible, But Russell Kirk is someone who I think emphasized some things about imagination that are consistent with some aspects of romanticism, especially emphasis on the sublime, a very Burkean notion, right? The idea of the sublime, which conjures up not only intense joy and ecstasy, but also deep dread and anxiety. These are all part of the human condition and part of what it means to be created in the image of God. And those are things, I think, that are very important in the conservative movement. We could talk about that. We can have a whole session on that, but that's a very important insight and question, I think, for it.
So I know you just spent 45 minutes telling us that conservatives look backward and not forward. But can you tell us if you were teaching this session 30 years from now, looking back at right now, who would you be including as these are the great conservatives of the moment, whether politicians or writers or artists or what have you?
You are really setting me up to be killed at the end of this session today. Okay, I'll throw some names out. This is not going to be a comprehensive list, but these are some people I think that represent conservatives today, for good and for ill, not just people I admire. And also recognize that my answer to your question, Court, I am a historian, and so I read historical figures a lot more than I read current day people, and that's maybe a weakness of mine. But I'll start with someone like George Will. George Will, I think, is a very important conservative of our time, and over the past 30, 40 years. I think, some of you probably agree with a lot of things he says, some of you will not. But George Will is a very important conservative. Yoram Hazony is a very important conservative figure today. His understanding of nationalism is very, very important conservative understanding. Someone like, I almost said Catherine Drinker Bowen, but she's not really a person from today, but a conservative historian of the founding. I would say someone like Amina Melinek is someone who is an important conservative writer. I think she's someone who is on the rise. She's a younger person, someone that I think has far to go. And I think 30 years from now we will be reading her writings. I think she's a very important conservative figure. I think someone like more public might be Kellyanne Conway. I think that she is an important voice in conservative politics today, who is a person who is both excoriated and hated and also loved in America. Someone who's instantly recognizable when her face comes on. I think she's someone who is a representative of conservatives in 2022. In terms of, this might not be intuitive to you, but I regard historians as being important conservatives. I think Alan Gelzo is an important conservative historian in his writing on Lincoln, his writing on the Civil War, his new biography of Lee, because he has a view of education very much like Robert Maynard Hutchins, that education is for citizenship, not just to make widgets out of people. So those are a few names. You kind of put me on the spot, but those are some names you may agree, disagree, add, subtract from that list. But those are some folks I think we'll still be considering in decades in the future.
Before I ask my question, I just want to make it clear that I identify, is this on or?
Yes.
I identify as a conservative, as a Christ follower, and love my country. So just get that out there.
Sounds good.
How would you, if you believe that God's covenant is with Israel, with the church, and not with America, how do we balance our citizenship in heaven with our citizenship, primarily in America, but other countries, and we see these issues out there, and the activist adrenaline gets going in us, and how do you counsel your students, your kids? How do you counsel people how to balance those two citizenships?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would look to one of the greatest examples I think that helps us with this. I think is the exile, the 70-year exile in Babylon, especially when we read Jeremiah 28 through 33 in the Old Testament, where God is describing to Jeremiah what the experience of the exile will be like, that the people are going to be carried off from their homes, from their familiar areas, from the city of Jerusalem, the temple and all that. And they're going to be exiles in a foreign land, among foreign people, a people whose language you don't understand, who worship foreign gods. You're going to be a long way from home for 70 years. But what are you going to do? Well, you're going to pray for the city where you go. You're going to continue to marry and have children. You're going to preserve the traditions of the Torah. You're going to seek to the benefit and the uplift of the city to which you go. You're going to be sojourners in a foreign land, but in that foreign land, you're to claim it as your own. And then I'm going to return you to your home, and you're going to be established here, and I'll be your God, and you'll be my people. I think that is a type for us today as we consider our own sojourn in this world. This world is not our final home. We don't belong to this world. We are citizens of heaven. And yet, we do have a belonging with our families, in our, the land on which, our ancestors are buried, the land that we farm and cultivate and gives us our food, the places of our childhood that we love and like to take our children back to show them and to give them that as an inheritance. Our cultures and our music and our food and our way of life, these things are to be loved and to be stewarded and to be handed down, taken care of and cherished. Recognizing that we have an eternal home in heaven, and the two are not necessarily in conflict. But they have to be ordered. Our love for country, our love for hearth and home has to be an ordered love, as Augustine gave us wisdom on. Our love for God must take precedence over everything else. But then we order our loves. I mean, I have a wife and I have 2 children. Are you married and have kids? You will be glad to know that I love my wife more than I love yours. You aren't going to be offended by that at all, because you're going to know that even though I don't love your wife as much as I love my wife, I don't wish you and your wife any ill in the world. I only wish for you flourishing and happiness and peace and all good things. They are not mutually exclusive, right? Same with Mexico. I wish nothing but good things for Mexico. I think when Mexico flourishes, the United States flourishes. But I love the United States more than I love Mexico, because this is my country, and this is my home, and these are my people. But doesn't mean I don't like Mexico. I don't wish good things for Mexico. Now, I could. Now, this is what I write about, a little commercial over my book, American Exception. So the bad sort of dark versions of Christian nationalism, American exceptionalism, are racist and xenophobic and cast, our people as superior in comparison to an inferior other. And that certainly all through American history, we see that, we see expressions of that very prominently and very tragically. And we will always see those expressions. Those are never going away, because human nature is always going to be the same. But just because we always will live with fallen human nature in those expressions doesn't mean we shouldn't and can't hold to a righteous understanding of citizenship and country and home and loyalty to our people. When I get on a plane and go and fly somewhere, I'm with a bunch of people that I have never met. One thing that's interesting, people don't talk to each other on the plane anymore. You used to sit next to somebody on the plane and strike up a conversation with somebody. You can't do that anymore after COVID. People think you're weird. I like to talk to people on the plane. I like to know where they're from and why they're going to the place they're going. Nowadays, you can't talk to anybody on the plane. Everybody wants to just put their ear pods in and be left alone. I think that's bad, but that's sort of a side note. But assuming that, let's just say, for argument's sake, that everybody on the plane is an American. I don't know these people. I don't know what they're doing. Honestly, I don't really care. But there is something to be said that in a fundamental way, all those strangers on that plane are my people, because they're all Americans. And I can love them in an ordered fashion without hating anybody else that's not an American. And I think that that is a starting point. Some of you may disagree with some of that and maybe have other things, other insights to contribute, and we can debate and talk about that. But that's my understanding of what right citizenship. It should be ordered citizenship, just like I think order is something very important that we see. Russell Kirk being a person who stressed the importance of order. I think everything in our individual lives as well as in our society, right ordering leads to peace and flourishment.
It seems that certainly maybe since the Trump era, there seems to have been a fair bit of disordering within the conservative movement, and maybe in some ways an opportunity to reassess what conservatism means. It seems
Yes.
in many circles, I mean, just your talk, a case in point. Well,
Yes.
Let's redefine ourselves. I'm wondering where you think are there resources outside, as you mentioned, the American tradition or the narrow American tradition that we can draw from, and what do you think those are? I mean, maybe the African American, but also conservative movements that we're seeing elsewhere. Canada, where I'm from, there's been a huge movement of conservatism resurgent. Europe and the like. What are the things you think we could possibly draw from other traditions that might help us crystallize a new view of conservatism?
That's a challenging question for me because I'm not familiar with a lot of other traditions outside of the Anglo-American tradition. So that is a challenging question for me, and I have to confess some ignorance in that regard. But recognizing some diversity within the conservative tradition, and recognizing that libertarians and traditionalists are different, have different views, but share a lot of things in common that are conservative in their essence. I think is a good starting point. I brought up black conservatism because black conservatism is a tradition that is right next to white conservatism. I mean, I'm obviously a white person, and I have, grown up among white conservatives and consider myself to be a conservative and have inherited a particular tradition. But black conservatism is represented by people even like Marcus Garvey, from the 1920s, who is a very foreign type of a figure to me, and to my eyes and to my thinking. And I think also, to an important extent, Marcus Garvey represents someone who's a black conservative that is also rather foreign to other traditions within the black conservative tradition, rather foreign. The Back to Africa movement and so forth. Not everybody subscribed to that in his day, and still don't, but the embracing of those traditions and cultural contours, values, the nuances that are there, and the handing down of those unique things that identify African American traditions is something that I think we can all appreciate and learn from in some way. We have a lot of people from England, from across our cousins across the pond here. I think, I think one of the things that they offer us Americans is how to think about equality over and against hierarchy. I think the British are an interesting case study in how to balance hierarchy with equality, equality especially under rule of law, because I think England is still a much more hierarchical society than America's is. I could be wrong about that, but correct me if I'm wrong. But that tension between hierarchy and equality is something I still think Americans still struggle with. I think we all would agree as a fundamental proposition that natural equality is to be preferred over natural hierarchy. What's interesting is that for most of human history, natural hierarchy was assumed to be the way of things. And natural equality is very new and very innovative. That's another thing about conservatives is that ideas that were once very radical and very progressive, over the course of time, conservatives can embrace those things as conservative, like free market economics, capitalism, equality. Abraham Lincoln is a great example of this, how he stressed equality 7 years after the founding of the United States. Very, very recent innovation, and yet embracing it as a conservative principle, trying to conserve this idea of equality in the face of hierarchy represented by the Confederate South with the institution of slavery. I think it's human nature to always grapple with that tension between equality and hierarchy. And I think there are important case studies that we can look to in other cultures that can teach us about that tension, about how to navigate the challenges that come with that tension from societies that have had a longer experience with hierarchy than we have. So I have to confess a little bit of ignorance, but I appreciate your question. I hope that helpful.
Thank you. Just a sort of cautionary note that I think media will, Trump made a lot of unforced errors, but media will demonize any Republican candidate. And I agree that Trump is not a conservative. However, his serious speeches, whoever wrote them, like in Warsaw or at the UN, were often cherry-picked for the kind of MAGA thing, whereas he was really, if you listen to the whole speeches, saying, let's make Venezuela great again. I hope that Mexico's great again. Let's have Zimbabwe be great again. And he was, I think, really fighting the globalist oligarch problem in hope of sovereign nations.
Yes.
And so just a note to say, they did that to George Bush. They did that to Ronald Reagan. They'll do that to whoever runs in the future.
Yeah.
And so, let's not react to the decontextualizing nature of the soundbite media that is just looking for power and winning elections.
That is an excellent reminder. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I'm a college student, and I often find, young people, you have your Instagram bios, and it says, conservative, coffee lover, Christ follower, stuff like that. I have a lot of problems with that. But my question is, for young people, it seems like political identity is so crucial to who we are and how we interact and go to the classroom and talk to our parents and our friends. How, as a Christ follower, how should I interact with a political identity or a party affiliation? So I am first and foremost a Christ follower, or first and foremost a Christian, and not a conservative who goes to church. How would you say a proper view of party affiliation and an identity in Christ?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to say something that might be a little controversial, and you may disagree, and if you do, we can talk and debate and so forth. Because our society is so politicized, everything is politicized. The kind of soft drink you drink is politicized. The kind of coffee you drink is politicized, if you drink Black Rifle coffee, then you're a conservative. What? When did that start? I don't even know what that is, and yet, people wear T-shirts, and they take pride in their conservative identity because they don't drink Starbucks. They drink this thing called Black Rifle, which I've never tasted before. I'm sure it just tastes like a cup of coffee. But the hyper-politicization, I think, is a very bad thing. And there are interesting examples of conservatives that have emphasized that not everybody needs to be voting. I tend to agree to a certain extent, not all the way, but I do agree with this idea that, let's say that in the midterms this year, 2022 midterms, that there is a low voter turnout. They only say 30% of the people come out and vote. One thing that we don't hear a lot is that could mean that the people are content and they don't find a need to go out and vote. That could be an indicator of prosperity and stability. And of course, this is very important to conservatives, stability. And so that's not going to happen we're going to have a huge turnout because our society is so politicized. But because society is so politicized and everything that we do, from the most quotidian things that we do, is so politicized, that's bad. That leads to instability. And as a conservative, I think we can advocate that not everything has to be politicized. And I'm a big fan of voting. Don't get me wrong. I think we should vote. I think we should all participate. I'm very Tocquevillian in that regard. But I'm also Tocquevillian in the idea that voting is not the only thing we do for our civic virtue. We get involved in voluntary societies. We join a bowling league. Joining a bowling league is as patriotic as voting and necessary as voting, because it gets you out of the house, it forces you to interact with people that aren't like you, right? So those are some thoughts. It's unfortunate that we're so politicized, and the media, I think, does have a vested interest in keeping us divided. This is also something Tocqueville said about despotism. Keep the people divided, keep them isolated from one another, and that's a way to consolidate power in a centralized government.